So do feel free to jump in and ask questions. I don't know if this is like the most useful stuff for you, so do tell me if it's useful or not useful, because this is just stuff that I've kind of picked up along the way in trying to get people using conservation evidence in different ways. So I have borrowed extremely heavily from the social sciences, because why go out and reinvent the wheel when someone's already done the work for you? Sorry, computer fun. So books like this, so like the British Nudge Unit or Behavioural Insights team, that are looking at different ways to kind of change people's behaviour, what's actually effective in behaviour change, because as we all know, just saying things, telling people that they should do things like not use disposable forks and use real forks instead, just doesn't really work. And some of the main things that comes out of the Behavioural Insights team is that you've got to make behaviour change easy for people. If they have to kind of go up too much uphill struggle, they're just not going to do it. You have to make it attractive to them in some way so that this provides some kind of obvious benefit for them. You have to make it social, so it's got to be appropriate to the kind of the social group that they are working within. So if you make it as a professional norm of evidence that everyone within an organisation is using something, then people will just do it without really thinking about it or questioning too much. They'll just, they'll just get on with it. Whereas if they're the only person in an organisation who's interested in using evidence and everyone else is sort of pretty apathetic around them, then fairly quickly they will probably tend to slide into the ways of their peer group. And timely as well. So that's just kind of trying to find the best moments at which to kind of nudge people. So that might be when a whole organisation is changing their conservation rationale, or they're changing all of the way they do their management plans, or they're changing their website, or it might be for an individual that they're moving to, you might have like an individual who's particularly interested in evidence moving into a new job where they're quite influential. So you can piggyback off their enthusiasm and influence to kind of promote whatever you want to promote in terms of behaviour change evidence. So it's all a little bit soft and squishy because it's social science, but on the other hand, these things have been shown to have impact. So, we're going back. So framing discussions is something that's really, really important. So if you kind of go out there with an aggressive message of saying that you're not science-based, you're doing everything wrong, like nothing you've achieved in your conservation career is really worth anything, and we have no idea whether anything you've done has actually been any use whatsoever. Like, people are going to kick back against that. They're going to react badly against that. So obviously that's a very extreme example, but it kind of makes the point that if you go in there a bit and play a bit too hardball, people are going to switch off unless they have a reason to listen to you. However, if you can kind of flip things around and talk about how so much conservation work is done, but people don't share the results, and it's a huge shame because other people don't get to learn from that work that's done, and we should all be sharing our work and sharing our results so that we can all learn from each other. And then people kind of start listening a bit more, and you can start to put in, we're starting to share the evidence here. Oh, have you taken a look? Oh, it'd be so great if you could, publish something and put it in here. You could also really look at this when you're planning a project, because it might have something that you haven't seen yet, and kind of try and get in that way. So that's, in many ways, that's just shameless flattery of people, but it works. So then there's other ways you can frame discussions as well, obviously. That's just one example of one that I've tried to use. Interestingly, people sort of tend to do what they think their peers are doing, or the people that they identify with, people that are like them. So if you kind of say, no conservationists are really using evidence, that if people identify with the people you're talking about, that can sometimes mean to them that they're just doing the same as everyone else. They're doing the same as all the people like them. They like the people like them. Everyone does. So why should they change anything? So this is a kind of a really dicey topic to get into. I do bring it up sometimes, but I try to bring it up when I feel like I'm emphasizing the differences between the group I'm talking to and the group I'm talking about. it's also really good to emphasise where you've got stories about people using evidence that other groups associate with. So if you can say this is an organisation that's like you in whatever way, they work on the same species, they're about the same size, they're based in the same country, they're using evidence, this is how you do it, and kind of emphasising that is kind of quite a positive approach. Occasionally, if I'm talking to a group, for example, that identify themselves as being very science-based and probably are doing things quite differently from the majority of other conservation groups, I might bring it up that a lot of people aren't using evidence, but I still consider it a bit of a risky strategy. So I said it to all of you guys because you're all in a different position. You're kind of on board with, we're going to be writing stuff about evidence and using evidence. But yeah, going in there and kind of saying 90% of people don't use evidence, people go, well, so why should I be in that 10%? A lot of the time. It's really important to kind of try and tailor your messages for the different groups that you're talking to. And I'm still kind of trying to figure out how to do this a lot of the time. Sometimes tailoring involves making assumptions, which is not necessarily a very good thing to do. It's ideal if you can actually try and find out as much as possible beforehand about the people that you're going to talk to. But very broadly, you would probably want to tailor things slightly differently for a bunch of students than you would for a bunch of conservation funders. And you'd want to tailor things again slightly differently if you're trying to talk to land managers. So think about who you're trying to talk to. Think about what their current likely level of knowledge is about conservation, about science, about conservation evidence. And think what they probably want to get out of a session. So try and put yourself a little bit in their shoes and think what they would like to learn. So students might be looking for a really good resource where they can get lots of references for exams at the moment, but then they might go on to work as a funder or a land manager or an on-the-ground conservationist, and it might be a useful resource for them then. Land managers might, think about what land they're managing. What are the messages from conservation evidence that are going to be most relevant to them? So thinking about what people care about. So that's the way to get people listening, I think, a bit more. And people care about all sorts of different things. They might be interested in a particular taxonomic group. They might be, for example, frog life or bat conservation international. You don't necessarily want to go in and start talking about mowing regimes for farmland birds because they're just not interested. Funders might care about their impact as a funder. That might be one way that you can tailor a message to them by saying you can have more impact if you only fund projects which are quite well evidence-based. Also, if you get your grantees to test an intervention and write up the results, A, you can directly see the impact you've had as a funder, but B, it's an output that you can, show when you're trying to get money from bigger funders, that you can show that you've had an impact and you've produced something and that you're evidence-based. Other people might be interested about, you might be talking to different groups who aren't necessarily conservationists but are interested in the wider landscape and what it looks like and things like that. People might be concerned about their professional reputation, so you might be able to kind of swing things a bit by sort of saying, well, if you're using an evidence-based approach, this is a good thing for your professional reputation and you're not going to be kind of knocked back by doing things that then just don't work. Or it might be about a group's image as an NGO. So you might be able to say things like, well, as a small NGO, you might be able to attract more funding if you can show you're evidence-based and you're using evidence in making decisions, and also if you're then producing papers and reports where you've tested the interventions that you're doing. So you can go back and you can say, the conservation this particular conservation intervention that we've done this year has led to an increase of this number of this species. It's then very attractive for funders to buy into. So there's all sorts of different things there. So I think I was probably drinking a little bit too much caffeine this afternoon, but I did some stuff just, for a laugh. this is, you know, tailoring it, for example, if I wanted to look at me, and I'd be like, oh, what does Claire like? Claire really likes bats. So what are the kinds of messages that I would want to be going for? It's like, yeah, you know, bats are great. We should really conserve them. We can do that on conservation evidence. We can see whether different ways of conserving bats can work or not. It's really exciting. But, oh no, there's not that much evidence on different ways to conserve bats. And some things don't work well, so we're not saving bats effectively. So, you know, as someone who loves bats, I'm now feeling very sad. We need lots of research on bat conservation interventions, and we need to get people to stop things that don't work. You know, let's fix this terrible problem. And also, here are some nice pictures of bats, because we know that you care about bats. So here's some nice pictures of bats, and here's some baby bats, and they love evidence, and, you know, do you? Obviously, this is getting a little bit silly and slightly over the top, but you can kind of see what I mean. You might want to do something a bit more professional for another group. So, for example, if you're looking at a conservationist who's an ecological consultant and they do bat surveys, and you can sort of say, well, we've got loads of information about bat mitigation. Did you know that lots of commonly used mitigation techniques that you might be using in your job don't work very well or haven't been tested? This has gone off the slide a bit, sorry. You can tell them about things that haven't worked, like bat gantries, which I talked about yesterday. I talk about them a lot. Sorry, this is not aligned up very well. You know, ask people to think about the reputational damage of doing something that doesn't work. So, you know, all these kind of negative headlines in the papers where people have put up these gantries and it's not worked, and then they've been splashed over the BBC and all different newspapers and all the rest of it. Sort of say, well, that's not very good for your image as a professional ecological consultant. That's not very good for your company. Maybe you should be a little bit more evidence-based, and that way you can reputationally protect yourself. And again, you kind of want to think about the audience that you're talking to. So I know I'm guilty of it a lot, that I often go into a room of conservationists and kind of assume that a lot of them are going to be people a bit like me. And that's really not always the case. Conservationists come in all different, you know, types, and they have completely different interests, and they have completely different ways of framing things. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that if you start talking to people in a way which sort of counteract, which is at cross purposes to their identity, they're not necessarily going to listen to you. So there's all the kind of the graphs that show that as people become actually more scientifically literate, for example, in the States, Democrats and Republicans actually diverge further on their stances on particular issues. So the people who are less scientifically literate are actually closer together in their views. And as people gain more and more scientific knowledge on a subject, they just cherry pick out a lot of the time what confirms their own beliefs, and they diverge further and further away from each other. And there's also evidence that, for example, going in and talking, you know, for example, if you go in and sort of identify yourself extremely strongly with a particular sort of social or political viewpoint, it can be problematic. So you kind of got to think a little bit about your group. And I'm not kind of saying social, I'm sort of saying social and political in the broadest kind of sense, that, you know, going in and assuming that everyone in the room has a particular stance or leaning. It's actually quite good to try and not assume those things, but it's also quite good if you can know in advance who you're particularly trying to talk to and frame messages and tailor things around what's important to them. So there's lots of different types of people who might be interested in conservation. So you might have someone who is a socially conservative British landowning wildlife enthusiast who is also does some recreational shooting, but they might be interested in conservation. You'd probably frame a message for them somewhat differently to how you would frame it for a countercultural, feminist, socialist, liberal, green voting German ecology student. You would frame things differently again for a down-to-earth experienced South African conservation land manager This is actually a picture of a wedge-tailed eagle from Australia. So this guy's not South African, but he kind of fitted the mindset of what I was trying to to do there. We've cut the beak off so that hopefully you can't identify the species. And again, that's going to be a different viewpoint from someone who's a family-orientated Indian data analyst on a conservation project. All of those people are going to have, I should also point out at this point that these are all just pictures I've taken off the internet and don't necessarily represent real people. But all of these people are going to have different identities and different ways of thinking of themselves and of their conservation project and of you. They're going to have different preconceptions of you. And it's worth kind of thinking about all of that before you start trying to tailor something towards them. But yeah, that's kind of a bit dicey area. So one of the things that we have been trying to do over this course, which I'm failing to do in this particular session at the moment, is active learning. So this is a lot of the stuff that we were trying to do yesterday. And that means one definition of active learning is doing things and thinking about the things that you're doing, or metacognition. I find a slightly more useful definition because it's a bit more practical, encouraging student engagement through activity, group discussion, experimentation and role play, in contrast to passive memorization of information. So the idea being that, you know, a lot of the things that we were trying to do with you yesterday around having quizzes or getting into groups and trying to solve a problem together, we're trying to create a more active learning environment rather than doing exactly what I'm doing right now, which is just standing and talking. But it definitely, there's a lot of evidence that shows that this kind of approach leads to much better learning on pretty much anything. And so we think making things fun is part of active learning. So competitive elements, making things interactive, having prizes, and using humour wherever possible, which can obviously backfire as well, but grow a tough skin, or just don't bother with it. But we think that if you make things fun, then people will learn better. And tell stories. So as scientists, a lot of the time we get really used to just using statistics and facts, and 57% of people believe that, and 35% of people did the other. And that can be quite useful to make a point. But the human brain responds very well to narrative and to stories. So for example, this is a story that we like to tell people about some kind of lateral thinking in conservation and how important it is to share evidence from the conservation of projects you're doing. So there were some people trying to save the echo parakeet. I can't remember where, but I think it's somewhere in West. There we go, thank you. I was like, where does it live? Somewhere warm was where I got to. And they had a problem of snails going into the holes, in the nest holes in the trees, and they covered the chicks up in slime, and then the chicks died. And this didn't really seem like a very good thing. So a bunch of conservationists came up with this idea of putting copper bands around the trees to try and stop the snails from going into the nest holes. And when they put the copper bands around, they saw that the snails stopped, they wouldn't go past the copper, and it saved the chicks. And they published this story in Conservation Evidence. Pretty much straight after it was published, a group of British conservationists who were trying to save the red helleborine orchid read this study, and they were having a lot of problems with snails eating their orchids. And they read this study and they thought, oh, well, if copper stops snails from going into nest holes in Mauritius, they can just as well stop snails from eating red helleborines in Britain. So they made these cages and they put copper bands around them for the red helleborine and the plants. These are critically endangered species of plant. And lo and behold, the plants that had these copper bands around them didn't get eaten by snails. So we could talk about something about like the percentage of studies that have been or the number of studies we've published every year, or the number of people that visit our website, and we do that as well. But people remember stories much, much better. So hopefully we're now going to have time in a minute for some discussion and feedback. I think it's often quite important to try and build trust with a group. So if you've got the chance, for example, if you're going and talking to a group outside your work, or if you're talking to a group inside your work, actually spending time with people outside of the session is quite good. So, for example, I met Mike, who was here yesterday at a conference in Shropshire, and I went in to give a talk, but I stayed for the entire 2 days, which meant that and went to everyone else's talks and talked to people, which meant that you built much more of a rapport with people, and then the next time you bump into them, you've built a better relationship, you've built a bit more trust. So listen to people, engage with their concerns. So for a lot of people, this might be a very new way of working. They might have specific concerns, for example, about what we're missing in the grey literature, about areas that we haven't covered yet, about whether their particular sector they deem their particular sector able to engage with this, for example, particularly if they're in government. And look at ways in which you can kind of address those concerns. So, for example, the grey literature thing has come out that Bexy's been doing heaps of work on building this literature of grey, building this database on grey literature. And that's come out of the fact that lots of people have said to us, yeah, but you're missing heaps of evidence from unpublished reports. And when people keep saying that, and you keep hearing the same message over and over from bunches of different people, you think, okay, this is something we've actually got to address. This is something we've got to put sort of time and effort into. And it is going to be, I think it's already been a lot of time and effort, and it's going to be a lot more. But we know that we're meeting people's needs better if we do this. And I think I was mentioning it the other day, and Bill was talking about it, that we're going to try and produce some guidance documents at some point. And again, that's come out of several different meetings that we've been in, and we've talked to people, and they've said, well, I can't really see my reserves managers or whoever looking at a website, but if you can produce a guidance document, they'd read a guidance document if they had a printed guidance document which had some practical information in there and some pictures of what they're actually meant to be doing and that sort of thing. So it's definitely really important because it's a two-way street. And also follow-up work's really important. So generally it takes more than just one-off thing to change behaviour. We haven't kind of entirely fixed this problem yet. That's a lot of the reason why we're trying to work with a lot of NGOs one-on-one. But even if you're just teaching one class with people, there might be other ways in which you can try and follow up with them. So you can advise them to sign up to our newsletter, for example, or follow us on social media. And that way people keep getting like a little reminder of what's gone on. And it's not just like they've walked in, they've had the conservation evidence thing, and then they've walked back into their normal life and their real life and they've forgotten all about it. Little nudges can be quite helpful. You might have the resources and the time to give a follow-up workshop to people and see what they've been doing. And again, you know, it's probably, I don't know how much you guys are going to have the capacity to do this, but just as a kind of broader point, working with people quite directly is one way of kind of following up with them. So I think we've got time for a little bit of discussion now about whether you think you're going to be teaching, who you might want to teach to, whether it's students in your university, for example, and how you think you could teach. And just to let you know that we can provide all the slides from all of our workshops to you and all the handouts and all the information. And you can also email me.